familiar with my channel will know that my last video that wasn't a 40-minute shitpost about Chicken Run being the greatest piece of communist art ever made was quite a drama-heavy video, and it produced a small degree of discourse. But what that video also did was quickly become the most successful and highly viewed video I've ever done. Increasing my views, increasing my subscribers, increasing my income. I mean, that's right folks, I can nearly afford rent. This is YouTube aristocracy of almost being able to pay rent. So there's like a significant monetary incentive for me to rejig this channel, keep making beef heavy videos, like rejig it as some sort of drama reaction channel. But instead of doing that, instead of doing the smart thing for making rent, today we're gonna get into some really dense and hopefully dry theoretical stuff that I've been working on as the latest part of my PhD. You know, stuff that isn't really interesting to anyone except me. I should do a better job of introducing topics on this. This isn't really grabbing people, is it? Well, fuck it. I said we were going to tank the channel today. That's what we're going to do. So if you're here for some hot takes or boiling piss, I have some bad news for you. Instead today we're going to use social reproduction theory to try and bridge the gap between neoliberal subjectification and primitive accumulation, and understanding the fundamental roles that patriarchy and racialization play in this process. So no threatening to stuff any wee dark streamers into lockers today. Maybe the odd theorist might threaten to stuff in a locker, but no streamers. So there's sometimes a kind of petty disregard for the role of subjectification and ideology within neoliberalism from certain Marxists, because much of this sort of content in the discussion comes from or is influenced by Foucault, and Marxists are like, ah no, don't use Foucault, you're so sexy, and while it's true that I am sexy, I've been really trying, I will be using Foucault. So what is subjectification within neoliberalism, and how does it play such a central role? So as I've talked about many times on this channel, a central part of neoliberalism is the project to reforge the individual into a particular ways of being in a particular kind of person, a particular subject. It's to reforge the individual into a homo economicus, to put it in Foucauldian terms. Foucault talked about this as like a process of creating a particular neoliberal subject. Subjects that are in the first instance individually responsible, capitalistic, entrepreneurial, and capitalistic.
You said hard work twice!
That's because it takes twice as much work as perseverance.
A process of making you an entrepreneur of the self. Gross. So subjectification is this process of creating a subject, and it's absolutely essential to neoliberalism. Folks like Hayek thought that the people, you know, people behaving in ways that were like counter to this subjectification, you know, being collectivist, being individualistic, not being a dickhead. He saw this as a prime moral failing that would lead to the destruction of Western civilization, of Western capitalism, and bring us down the road to serfdom. May have put too much chilies in this and fried them too quickly. Oof. Neoliberals like Hayek believe that in order for the ideal market system to function, the ideal market subject has to be created. It is absolutely central to their ideas. One Italian called Lazar. Why did I specify he was Italian? Is this anti-Italian racism the only real racism? Anyway, One Italian, Lazzarato, built on Foucault's idea of homo economicus and of creating a certain subjectivity to argue that debt functions as one of the primary means through which these neoliberal subjectivities are now created. For Lazzarato, the rise of indebtedness under neoliberalism represented a fundamental shift in how subjectivities were produced and reproduced under capitalism. And it also represented a shift in how this subjectification reconstructed the commodity that we can call labour power, which is going to get important later. Labour power, by the way, refers to the capacities that we have, both mentally, physically and socially, to produce shit, to do shit, to make fucking videos or go to work. That's your labour power, essentially. So we're all constrained under capitalism in how we use our labour powers. I can't spend my life, just cooking or making music, no matter how much I'd like to. I have to sell my labour on the market, or like the ideal neoliberal subject that I am, depressingly, I can monetize my hobbies and make YouTube videos for money. I've become the entrepreneur of the self. Right, thanks me from the future once I've filmed that bit. Smooth transitions could do a presenting job easily. This neoliberal subjectification constrains our labour powers in specific ways, essentially. For Lazzarato, it forces us into debt and produces certain structural and moral pressures on behaviour. Debt is seen not just as like a condition of precariety, but as a moral failing. If you're in debt, then you've failed as a person, particularly, and we'll get into this later on, particularly if you're a single mother or a racialised person. It's a singular moral failing for you. And it makes us increasingly precarious. Maybe debt forces us into taking more than one job, or in monetizing our hobbies, forcing us into becoming entrepreneurs of the self. Or maybe it constrains collective expressions of labour power by atomizing us and making us individually responsible, breaking up our connections to our communities or to our friends or families or even just our workplaces. So essentially, subjectification alters the ways in which our labour powers are constrained or set in motion along particular neoliberal lines for the purposes of creating the perfect neoliberal actor for the perfect ideal market system.
Just going through the edit there, and I thought maybe we needed to clarify more what this idea of constraining and setting in motion labour power, what that really means, because I'm going to repeat that a lot and it's going to get annoying, and especially if you don't know what it means. So essentially when I'm saying constraining your labour power, we're saying that there are particular ways in which you can't activate your labour. You can't go and do something because you have to maybe do something else, or it's inaccessible to you. So for example, before women could enter the workplace, their labour was constrained in certain ways. Or should I say, white women generally in the global north, their labour was constrained in certain ways, because when we say set in motion, you could maybe think by contrast, black women, their labour was set in motion at the service of white households. They were forced into workplaces to work in particular ways. So when we say constrained and set in motion, that's what we mean. You're either stopped from working or forced into a particular way of working. It might not be as overt as state authorities forcing you into work, but it might just be societal forces. Hope that clarifies things, because we're going to be using that phrase a lot. Back to Computer John.
In this sense, we can say that subjectification is both produced and productive, in that it is at first created and then in turn recreates the systemic conditions for its own creation. It's dialectic. Just ticking off my use of dialectic for the day.
The production of subjectivity, of forms of life, of forms of existence, is not part of a superstructure, but rather of an economic infrastructure. Moreover, in the current economy, the production of subjectivity reveals itself to be the primary and most important form of production, the commodity that goes into the production of all other commodities.
I like the bass. I like the buttery biscuit bass.
Subjectification, then, is a means of controlling life. It's what Foucault would have called biopolitical. We're really blending together some Marxian and Foucauldian shit today, folks. hence the cooking metaphor, you know? Lots of ingredients, maybe a bit tortured. Not the food, food's going to be good. So Lazzarato would point to things like the welfare system as a really good example of a combination of these like structural and moral conditions for creating this sort of indebted neoliberal subjectivity. You know, in the welfare system, social rights are transformed into social debts whereby you as an individual owe society. If you're on welfare, you owe the state and society. These structural and moral conditions are then leveraged to produce certain neoliberal behaviours and subjectivities. They're leveraged to constrain and set in motion labour power in particular ways. But one notion with Lazzarato's work in The Making of the Indebted Man is that his conception of subjectification is quite flat. I mean, this is sort of hinted at by the title of the book, The Making of the Indebted Man. You know, that obscures that debt and subjectification influences and interacts with different conditions and different subjectivities in different ways. Basically, debt operates differently across racial, gendered and ableist lines. So for example, in my video on neoliberal feminism and the reconstruction of patriarchy through neoliberal feminism, I argued that gendered subjectification under neoliberalism sought to not only create homo economicus, making women individually responsible, personally responsible and, you know, all that jazz, all that shite, but it sought to reinforce the racialized and gendered socially reproductive roles that are often placed on the shoulders of women and on femme subjects. If, as Lazzarato argues, subjectivities and the subjectification is central to the economic base
I like the buttery biscuit base
of society, then we have to accept that racial, gendered and ableist divisions within that subjectification are also essential to that economic base. It implies that these differences in subjectification are class characters. They influence the class formation of society, of the entire economic and political system. This is something we're going to come back to in a bit, along with a discussion of what happens when you reject subjectification by the system, by neoliberalism or capitalism in general. So to briefly sum up, which we're going to be doing a lot today because a lot of this is quite dense. There's going to be summing up throughout, which, you know, I'm repeating myself, but you gotta make sure we're all on board, because even I don't really know if this is all correct. This is new to me. This is my own theorising, so might be talking shite. Who knows? We'll wait for the Viva. Or the YouTube comments. The YouTube comments, same thing. To sum up briefly, though, subjectification under neoliberalism refers to the process of creating particular kinds of subject. This is done using state and economic tools as well as sort of moral dimensions, morally pushing folk into certain behaviours and certain ways of being. And this process affects the fundamental relations between subjects and capitals, between groups and capital. Capitals, I just said there, I meant capital, and alters the formation of the commodity of labour power, which is constrained and set in motion in particular ways. It is both produced and productive in that it is essential for the continued function of neoliberal capitalism. It's dialectic. I'll note that mention of dialectics down later. But these aspects of subjectification might bring us to think about a concept we might not necessarily immediately expect, and that's primitive accumulation. Always put black beans in your chili. That's what I'm making today, a nice chili. Fully vegetarian. For much of its historical development, the idea of primitive accumulation, or original accumulation if you're a big nerd and you're into quibbling over Marx translations. In much of the literature on primitive accumulation, and for much of its history as a concept, it was referred to as quite simplistically the process by which the conditions for and the original capital required to, get capitalism going were required and was made. Process of dispossession and that. And it's been seen as like set into a very specific historical period. That is, it's been viewed as being temporally limited to a very specific time period immediately preceding capitalism, as a precondition to its development. The common example that's often cited and maybe over-relied on by some of the more Eurocentric Marxism, this is us maybe starting to get some beef going maybe with these Eurocentric Marxists. They get the locker ready. Yeah, an example which is often used by these more Eurocentric Marxism as like the most important time and location for primitive accumulation, and that is the process of enclosures in England. So the enclosures were a process of privatising land that was previously commonly held and ejecting the serfs from that land, forcing them to sell their labour power on the market. Their labour power was constrained and set in motion in particular capitalist ways. It was constrained from working collectively in this common land, but set in motion on the labour market. See what I mean? Capital was acquired through privatising the land, and the conditions for capitalism were created by proletarianising the serfs into an emerging working class. They were separated from their means of production and social reproduction and forced to sell their labour power on the market. But the sort of central importance of this part of primitive accumulation, which writers like Ellen Meskin Wood place on the enclosures, tend to overemphasize the importance of England for the development of capitalism. Like it tends to view the development of capitalism as a truly just internalized process. This tends to miss the central importance of colonialism and slavery in primitive accumulation, both in terms of generating capital for the emerging capitalist class and for reordering the social relations of capitalism alongside, new capitalist forms of white supremacy and patriarchy. While authors like Woods tend to focus on England as like the central generative location for capitalism, that's right, this is now an Ellen Meskin Wood beef channel. Get in the locker, Ellen. Oh, that's nice. Oh, that's nice food. Others like Walter Rodney point out that the role of colonialism, of slavery, of the sort of international was as much, if not more important for the development of capitalism. Basically the point being that this sort of traditional story of primitive accumulation, meaning just this one process that happened at this particular time, has been problematized by other authors who've spread it spatially in different points. That's the point to take away there. And additionally to this point, the temporal limitation to primitive accumulation, like the idea that it occurred in just this one period of time preceding capitalism, required to get capitalism going, has also been thrown into doubt by authors like David Harvey and De Angelis. Both authors argue that primitive accumulation isn't just one process that happened in the past in this particular time, but is a constantly required process of capitalism. It's always ongoing. There's always more primitive accumulation to do. Like that capitalism requires a constant process of further dispossession in order to keep itself going. So primitive accumulation is neither temporally nor spatially bound to this particular time period in England and whatever. It's more elastic than that. As an aside, I don't really like David Harvey's book that much. I don't like it's what's called like Imperialism in the 21st Century, or something like that. It's in the bibliography. I didn't really like it very much, and it kind of annoys me because I have to cite it a lot because one chapter in it is really influential. But yeah, the rest of the book just like didn't think it was very good. And this is the sort of thing that annoys me now. This is what my life's become. Being annoyed about having to cite a book I didn't really like that much. What a sad life. Good chilly, sad life. Others like Federici have argued that primitive accumulation, neither being spatially nor temporally bound to this particular place in England, they argued that it wasn't just a process of freeing up capital and of proletarianizing the serfs, but it was a process of reordering and reconstruction gendered and racial divisions within society into particular capitalist ways. It was the process through which capitalist patriarchy was established. So Federici argues that it's more than just dispossession of previously commonly held lands and the forcing of serfs to sell their labour on the labour market, but it required a reordering of patriarchy to function in particular capitalist ways. And as Federici points out, this is more than just internal to like England and the construction of gender there, but processes of colonialism also altered patriarchy and gender and altered the relations to capital in that way as well. So the form like this dispossession takes doesn't just like create workers, like workers in quotes, but disaggregates them, but separates them via like the recreation or the reconstitution of race and gender along capitalist lines and the reconstitution of patriarchy along capitalist lines. Labour powers are constrained and set in motion in dramatically different ways compared with different groups. See where I'm going with this yet? God, that's good. So for example, in order for capitalism to function, required that there would be a firm line drawn between productive and socially reproductive labour, with the value of the socially reproductive labour like keeping the household together, cooking and cleaning, looking after children, obscured and subordinated to the value of productive labour. The generation of commodities on the market. And importantly, this undervalued socially reproductive labour was placed on the shoulders of women, which further devalued women within this capitalist patriarchy that was developing, that is being developed as we speak. So what this shows us is that primitive accumulation and the experiences of primitive accumulation weren't produced evenly across these sexed lines. Social reproductive labour is both gendered and gendering. It is both produced and productive. And similarly, of course, like colonialism and slavery are naturally racializing processes. They reorder social relations, creating distinct ideas of race within capitalism. The primitive accumulation of colonialism and slavery didn't just funnel wealth from Africa to the global north. It didn't just establish an unequal system of market exchange and market relations, but reconstructed the idea of race, creating the category of whiteness against which the idea of blackness or the native is positioned. So as people like Francois Vergas and Federici point out, notions of gender were also created in conjunction with the racializing processes of colonialism and slavery.
According to Federici, primitive accumulation should not be conceived simply as an accumulation and concentration of exploitable workers and capital, but also as an accumulation of differences and divisions within the working class, whereby hierarchies are built upon gender as well as race and age, became constitutive of class rule and the formation of the modern proletariat.
These weren't just issues of identity, but of the direct relations that different groups have had to capital, and the ways in which their labour power is constrained and set in motion. And so we can argue that this disaggregating, this reordering of gendered and racial social relations is itself a class formation, a class relation, which impacts the very core of how capitalism functions. So I realise that this is quite a lot. It's like a lot to take in. I know, because I probably don't understand it all myself because I'm still figuring it out. I maybe should have written the PhD before I wrote a YouTube video. Swings and roundabouts. But I haven't really begun to scratch the surface here. The main points to get really are that primitive accumulation is a process not just confined to the past, but ongoing throughout the entirety of capitalist history and ongoing to date. It's not simply about dispossession or generating capital, but it's about like the specific ways in which that process of dispossession are done as a way to generate specifically capitalist forms of racism and patriarchy, and that the social relations generated by it are specifically class relations. Class subjects are generated. Now we're going to try and mix together, visual metaphors, all this different shite that I've been talking about. See if we can bring together neoliberal subjectification and primitive accumulation, and we're going to use a massive pinch of chili powder or social reproduction theory to do it. There's none left. So far, to sum up again, we have spoken about how neoliberalism creates certain subjectivities of like the entrepreneurial, personally responsible, individualistic subject. And we've talked about the use of debt and like facilitating the creation of such subjectivities, and how such processes affect the formation of labour power under neoliberalism. And we've talked about how primitive accumulation as a process is not only ongoing, it's not temporally limited to a pre-capitalist era, but it's ongoing, but it's also encapsulates more than just the dispossession of previously commonly held land, and is about the reordering of social relations too. So how do these things connect? How can we mash together neoliberal subjectification and primitive accumulation? Is subjectification a form of this primitive accumulation? So first, I think it's important to point out that a lot of the discussion about primitive accumulation in the neoliberal era has had more in common with Harvey's idea of accumulation by dispossession rather than Federici's idea of like the reordering of gendered and racialized social relations to capital. We hear a lot in the sort of Harveyan sense. Harveyan? Is that a word? I'm going to use it. We hear a lot in the Harveyan sense, whereby marketization and privatization represent that dispossession that Harvey points to. That's a form of primitive accumulation. Commodities that were previously held in common are privatized and placed in the market sphere. But while this gets some way, I think, to understanding primitive accumulation under neoliberalism, I feel like it stops short of examining the precise ways in which social relations are reordered, in which labour power is constrained and set in motion under neoliberalism. And similarly, while examining subjectification can get us some way to understanding the changing relations between subjects and capital, such discussions sometimes fall into being quite flat, quite dimensionless. They fail to place the subjectification within a historical process in which racialization and gender divisions already exist. You know, it's like as Lazzarato does, like maybe simplifying subjectification to one process rather than many processes disaggregated along different dimensions. We need to understand how such subjectification is disaggregated along these different group lines. Also, like, given that on the one hand, the self-conscious purpose of neoliberals is straining to create a particular neoliberal individual to facilitate the maintenance of a capitalist system, and on the other, the purpose of primitive accumulation is to establish and maintain the conditions for capitalist accumulation, it seems, I don't know, weird to me that no one has attempted to bridge this gap in this particular way, this specific way I'm doing it here. I don't know, maybe it's because I'm talking shite. Who knows? We'll see. The Viva will judge me, or the YouTube comment section, one or the other. So to do this merging, this mashing together of theory, which again, very much flying it on the seat of my pants on this one, but to see if we can bring these theories together, mash them together, I'm going to be using social reproduction theory, a branch of Marxism which is deeply indebted to Marxist feminism, and which
understands social reproduction in terms of the inner connections of household, neighbourhood and community activities with the monetised social activities, predominantly wage labour, necessary to market-dependent reproduction, wherein food, housing, transportation, clothing and so on must be purchased as commodities. The term monetised activities points to the fact that while wage labour is the principal means of subsistence for the dispossessed, activities such as street vending, selling sex and independent domestic production are also part of the social picture.
So in short, SRT allows us to see how primitive accumulation and subjectification are linked and how they interact by allowing us to examine the different ways in which subjectification, as part of an ongoing process of primitive accumulation, is disaggregated along these racial, gendered and ableist lines once we get to that next time.
Social reproduction theorists are aware that valorization requires labor power set in motion, and that this motion is premised not just on the bald fact that workers are separated from the means of production. Crucially, it is premised on the actual ways workers are separated from the means of production, in different and historically changing patterns.
So SRT helps us to understand the precise ways in which neoliberal primitive accumulation separates individuals from the means of production and the means of social reproduction, and forces them into particular subjectivities. It constrains and sets in motion labour power in particular ways, which are different across different group lines. Not a singular or a flat process. And we can look to a couple different examples to sort of illustrate this. So again, going back to my video on neoliberal feminism, if you can't tell, I like that video. The ways in which neoliberal subjectification works for women is to not only force them into being your classic individually responsible or entrepreneurial subject, but also reinforces the gender division in social reproductive labour. Women are expected to not only be economically responsible subjects, responsible to the economic system, the market system, to be good workers, but they're expected to be responsible for the socially reproductive labour of maintaining the household or of raising children, reproducing the labour power of the household, of the family, of society itself. Her labour power is constrained by these specific responsibilities. And if a woman is successful enough, or lucky enough, or because of systemic factors normally tied to whiteness or tied to class, if she's successful enough in her productive labour, she can often export the socially reproductive labour of childcare, of cooking and cleaning to often racialised and migrant women. But this still reinforces the idea that women, even when they're employed, even when they're existing within the labour market, should still be responsible for that social reproductive labour. And more than this, the predominance of racialised and migrant women in this sort of role reinforces the racial and gender division of labour, whereby racialised women care for the children or care for the households of white, wealthy women. And this is all bound up with the gross ideas of the family, reconstituting the family as a business, as a site of exchange. And you can see the sort of complex disaggregation of subjectification at work here. Subjectification is here reordering the gendered and racial social relations to capital, consistent with Federici's view of primitive accumulation, but done in a particularly neoliberal way. But can we say that this really fully encapsulates the process of primitive accumulation? Or is it just simply conceptual overlap? Am I just adding random shit to the pot and stirring it? If I am, it tastes good. The pot is theory. The pot is theory. I'm gonna get that on a t-shirt. The pot is theory. Maybe easy to misconstrue. The cooking is theory? Basically, is there any connection between gendered neoliberal subjectification and the separation from the means of production, the means of reproduction, which would force people into neoliberal capitalist subjectivity? And the answer is obviously yes. Otherwise I wouldn't have said all this. I'm making an argument here, so yes. But I'll cut to me in the room to explain why. So let's take, for example, increased precariety. And while neoliberalism has sort of reinforced the gendered social reproductive role of parenting for women, it simultaneously placed upon them an expectation to be economically useful, economically viable subjects. But it's also at the same time, attacked labour standards, cut community services, cut after school clubs, cut childcare and healthcare, all of which are essential to parenting, to socially reproducing a family. Previously, such social programs, such state-funded programs, worked to subsidise the means of social reproduction. But under neoliberalism, there's been a dispossession, a marketisation of such means of social reproduction, which has forced the responsibility of that social reproduction back onto the shoulders of women. The neoliberal accumulation by dispossession is simultaneously and, internally constitutive of, it's part of that process of placing the responsibility of social reproductive labour back on the shoulders of women. These are clearly, these are one and the same process, the subjectification and the accumulation. And not to hark on to this particular phrase, but neoliberalism and this dispossession and subjectification has increasingly constrained women's labour power in a different way to that of men. So returning to Lazzarato's argument on indebted subjectivities, the subjectifying and primitive accumulation processes mean that such indebted subjectivities are substantively different at a base level. They're experienced totally different. And this is like integral to creating different class formations. The processes of dispossession have reoriented the social relations of women along gendered lines. Subjectification and primitive accumulation as one process.
If working classes are to be understood as formations rather than structures, this is in part because of the making of class relations and experience by workers themselves. And as we have argued, these relations and experiences are multidimensional, while also governed in this society by an overriding social logic based on market dependence and capital accumulation. By tracing the patterns of gender and racialization that are constitutive of working class formation from the start, we can illuminate the ways in which movements for gender and racial justice are central features of class struggle. It follows that most significant social struggles are not unidimensional. However much they may exhibit class features, such struggles also frequently express challenges to gender, racial and sexual orders.
On top of this, if you're not done enough already, not overwhelmed enough already by all of this, the patterns of global dispossession, which have produced precarious migration patterns from the global south to the global north, has affected the supply of cheap, racialized, particularly migrant women for filling up the socially reproductive roles within society. You go into any hospital or any care sector, you'll find a predominance, an overpredominance of racialized and migrant women. Within nursing, within care work, within cleaning, it's consistent.
A central feature of the neoliberal era has been the globalization of primitive accumulation. Unrelenting, large-scale processes of dispossession have dramatically swelled the size of the global labor reserve, while also rendering it more international than ever before.
Neoliberal international trade agreements like NAFTA encourage the privatization of previously held common land and the destruction of state-funded services within states like Mexico. And in doing so, they create a sort of global reserve of precarious migrant labour, which is kept all the more precarious with increasingly authoritarian bordering and securitization policies. We're getting back into real grim territory again. And this is one of my videos. This isn't Chicken Run anymore. So not only does this process of primitive accumulation and bordering create like a really precarious neoliberal subjectivity with heavily constrained labour power, but that so many caring roles within the global north pull in precarious gendered workers shows how social reproduction is internally constitutive of these patterns of primitive accumulation and subjectification, and shows how gendered and racialised subjectivities are like absolutely essential to maintaining not only like your bog standard white male neoliberal subjectivity, but the middle class and wealthy female or girl boss subjectivity as well. It's both produced and productive. Using bog standard there to both centre my own sort of subjectivity and hint that I'm not centering it by making it sound like a joke. And then I'm pointing at it like that to try and cover up that I made a mistake. I could have just edited it out, but I kept it in. Is this a joke? You'll never know. Don't try and pin me down. That was weird. So I want to take a slightly different approach now, take a slightly different example to try and understand how racialization and neoliberal subjectification interact with like this primitive accumulation. Fuck, so many words. Like, come on, John. There's so many words there. I want to talk about also about what happens if people reject subjectification, if they don't conform to the ideal that's being sort of hoisted upon them. How these processes interact with GRT peoples, that's Gypsy Roma Tramler peoples, is useful in doing this. And I want to talk about this partly because, you know, it's an under-discussed area on the left, which is still packed with racism against everyone, but it's rarely discussed the racism of against GRT peoples that is endemic throughout society and still on the left and under-confronted. So I want to talk briefly about that, but also because it's become really relevant to my PhD work. Naturally, all things that are important for my PhD are the best and most important things. This chili must be important to my PhD because it is fucking good. So one of the primary means of primitive accumulation during neoliberalism has been the privatisation of land and the stripping back of land rights. For GRT peoples, this obviously has hugely negative impact on their ways of life. You know, it either pushes them into fewer and fewer ill-equipped stopping zones, which often don't have toilets, so don't have bins, don't have access to basic means of life, or it criminalises them by forcing them into illegal stopping places, where they're often harassed and attacked by police and local communities. And as I think anyone on the left should be well aware, criminalisation is often a hugely racialised process. And what this points to is that there is a potential necropolitical impact of rejecting neoliberal subjectification. So GRT peoples have always eschewed capitalist subjectivities. You know, they've often refused that process of removal of land, of privatising of land, of becoming separate from the means of social reproduction and their means of production. They've often refused to become part of that labour market, to be proletarianised. So it's not new that they've been eschewing such subjectivities, but under the neoliberal era, this process has become intensified. The refusal to settle into these subjectivities dictated to them by neoliberalism through becoming a worker or refusing to allow their labour power to be constrained in particular neoliberal ways, often results in such peoples having the right to access healthcare or education being stripped away from them. It places them in conditions much closer to death. It takes away from their means of reproducing their entire culture, their entire way of life as a people, or as a collection of different peoples. They're viewed as unsubjectifiable and are therefore placed into this necropolitical death zone where, they're no longer controlled by the biopolitics of life-making means, but by their proximity to death, both individual and social death, group death, cultural death. So for GRT peoples, these processes of neoliberal primitive accumulation and subjectification are genocidal. Ah, fuck. I made it so far into this video without mentioning genocide. So to sum up, another dense section, they're all dense sections, to sum up another dense section, to maintain capital accumulation under neoliberalism, there's not just an extension of markets into new areas of the globe through like globalization or privatization, marketization, all that, but there's a reorientation. So many tations, god damn it, I should have spoken this out loud first, but there's a reorientation of social relations through things like the reduction in the ability of people to reproduce themselves, socially reproduce themselves, limiting things like access to welfare, and a reinforcing of the social relations which maintain capital accumulation through the continued dispossession of racialised groups and the reinforcement of gendered divisions and socially reproductive labour. I could have made this rhyme if I'd tried a little bit harder with the amount of shns that I'm adding in here. Ugh. And we can see this both internally through like national privatisations of the means of social reproduction, and globally through patterns of dispossession and international trade agreements and the growth of precarious migration. And basically, like, if we look at all of this, I've made way too much chilli, by the way. I'm going back to Scotland tomorrow. This is too much. I do not know how to cook for one person, or for one day. But if we look through this through the lens of neoliberal subjectification, through which social relations are reordered and labour power constrained, is through the creation of these neoliberal subjectivities, which alter and disaggregate social formations, like separate people into different groups, creating specific class characters for women or for racialised people. For women, this is expressed as a sort of reification or reinforcement of the specifically gendered division of socially reproductive labour through the creation of specifically gendered neoliberal subjectivities which maintain accumulation regimes, maintain capitalism, keep folk making that money. This is done through a separation from the means of social reproduction, which obviously disproportionately harms women and femme subjects. And for those sections of population that are considered unsubjectifiable, they are tossed into the fire of the market. They're subject to necropolitical conditions of living death, whether that's in the prison, the immigration detention centre, the welfare queue, constantly fighting to justify their existence. And for GRT peoples, it means pushing them towards the destruction of their entire way of life, the destruction of their people. Primitive accumulation and subjectification intersect via the realm of social reproduction. That's a tasty theory. It's a spicy theory. Ooh. I added a lot of chilli to that. I don't know if I got it all on film. Ooh. So why does any of this matter? Is it just me playing around with a concept to, make myself happy and feel like I'm contributing something to theory? Make myself feel like a clever wee boy? Oh, a little bit, yeah. But one useful point to bring up is that if we view neoliberal subjectification as a central feature, one of the central features of the neoliberal era, then we can more accurately understand the sort of insidious nature of the beast that we're up against. We can more critically examine claims of the death of neoliberalism and understand that the fight isn't over until these processes are completely dismantled. We can make sure to properly focus our attacks not on shallow areas like government spending or state intervention in the economy, but on this process of the central process of accumulation and group and class formation, which is ongoing, which has been in some ways accelerating during the post-COVID era. Neoliberalism is dead indeed. Moreover, by understanding that the process of neoliberal subjectification and primitive accumulation are not flat processes, but they affect different social groups differently. Oh, are we different things are different? Wasn't expecting that. Little different things are different in this video. That's fun. These processes affect different social groups differently and produce difference, reproduce difference, reproduce different relations to capital. We can begin to see how racialisation and gendering of different segments of populations is a process of class formation, and we can make sure to organise around these areas of social reproduction, of gender and of race. We can seek to break neoliberal subjectification. That's how we kill it. That's how we end neoliberalism, we need to break this process of subjectification. And we can do this by building collective resistance to racist, gendered and ableist systems of subjectification. Now, I didn't get to discuss ableism in detail here, but the next video will be exclusively about that. I feel like some on the left are like fully wedded to the idea that left-wing action should be confined only to the site of the labour union and should have like a really narrow view of class. I'm talking about Jacobin here. Jacobin, get in the locker with Ellen. Oh, very spicy. But this analysis shows that group difference, like gender and race, are class divisions. Not in any shallow sense, but they're formative of class relations. They form part of an economic base. They're both produced and productive. And as such, we should be consciously organising around the liberation of such groups, not as an additive to class struggle, but as class struggle. And one means of doing this is by resisting the process of neoliberal primitive accumulation and subjectification. Resisting the separation of people, of groups, from the means of production and means of social reproduction. We have to break these neoliberal subjectivities. And that's how we win. Alright, fucking hell, this has been a long video. I made a promise that I would never make a video over an hour long, and I'm gonna stick to that promise, but fucking hell, we got close here. This is quite a dense, quite a long, quite a boring video, so if you've reached the end, fucking well done. I don't think I'd reach the end of this. Anyway, I better think of new Patreon tiers because I'm about to read a series of names that is too long. So, deep breath, and we're going to read the lovely names of all my... Oh, first, thanks to Xander, Tom and Noah for their voices, I should say that. But also, let's read this long bunch of names and then have a wee think to ourselves about what I can offer patrons instead of reading off names, because this is getting ridiculous. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Ellis Trent, Flatulent Jiggly Liz Castro, A Ghost, Attercop, Kieran Gore, Niels Abildgaard, Rachel Mixon, Rich, Tinfoil Pancakes, Olivia Uwahand, Capitalism Sucks, Izzy Wintrell, Paul Singleton, Tamash Kistler, Seamus Morrison, Stephanie Beverlyson and Coast, and Nelly Zacheva, Mercutio, Daniel Hughes, Hey Joe, Luke Evans, Gary Dillon, Teo Adiwale, Callum, Psychanistan77, Peter Bakalek, Charlie Hallam, Dan Wheatley, Jam Devot, Jane Pickering, Out the Lad, Battle Whisk, Findlay, Bewick, Copley, Harry Hanford, Jens, Joel, Mackenzie Milton, Nemo, Paul Bartley, Aaron, Jade, Rembe, Altair Seal, Annabelle Baines, Azza Davis, Christopher Earp, Daniel Jocelyn, Deanna McMillan, DD, Dialectical Biologist, Harris Hawk, Raffin, Ian Curvin, Van Hound, Matthew Petit, Mustafa Salim Gayorient, Rebecca Mullen, Rebecca Sam Humlicker, Selena Ali, Supple Old Man, Gross, Tom Brady, White Leftist. Oh boy. Well, that was a lot. And just under 2 minutes. So if you reached the end of this video, good job. I love you. Bye.